Variações Goldberg, aqui no Film Arts.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming tonight. We are here to talk a little bit about this wonderful composition, and after having talked about it, we will listen to it from beginning to end. It will take a little less than 2 hours, which is shorter than Wagner's Rheingold, and the music is much better. Nothing against the genius of Richard Wagner, but this needs to be said. The notes that you heard a few seconds ago, they are 32 notes, and this is the actual theme of this composition. Even people who play the so-called Goldberg variations, when you ask them, please play the theme or sing the theme, they will immediately play this. Because they think the melody is the theme. What is a melody? In Bach's music, there is no such thing as melody and accompaniment, but there are voices, Stimmen in German, and the voices are independent, and they all have the same right to exist, just like in a good society. Now, the theme is the bass line. So, while the melody moves in one bar, the bass follows a much slower movement. And just like in architecture, when you observe a great cathedral like the Duomo of Florence, then of course we are immediately, our glances are diverted towards Brunelleschi's cupola. But this miracle of architecture would not stand without a solid foundation. And that's exactly how it is in music. So these 32 notes are divided into two halves. Then it's repeated. Now comes the second half. And it's repeated. Now, the theme is based on an aria in 3/4 time, written by Bach himself a few years earlier in 1725 for his beloved wife Anna Magdalena, in Notenbüchlein für Anna Magdalena Bach. And this is the actual aria. Why is this called the Goldberg Variations? Many of you will know the anecdote, but maybe not all of you, so let me tell it in a nutshell. In the city of Dresden, there was a very famous man, an aristocrat, Graf Kaiserling, and he was formerly Russian ambassador to Saxony. The Graf was a great music lover and enthusiast, and he often visited the city of Leipzig, where Johann Sebastian Bach lived. Among his servants, there was a young musician, Johann Gottlieb Goldberg, who was very young. He was 14 years old at this time. We are talking about 1741. And Graf Kaiserling suffered from insomnia, a lack of sleep. And during his sleepless nights, he liked to listen to music, to soothe his sufferings. And once he said to Goldberg, "Please go to Master Bach and order for me some beautiful music that I can listen to during my sleepless nights." And so Bach wrote this aria with 30 variations and delivered it to the Count, who was delighted with the music, and he often called Goldberg during the night and said, "Lieber Goldberg, please play me one of my variations." Imagine playing just one of the variations. He would never say, "Play me 30 variations." And he called them my variations, so he was very possessive about this. And this was the best payment Bach has ever received for his music. Apparently, a golden goblet with 100 pieces of louis d'or. Now, this is the story, the anecdote, as told by Forkel, the first biographer of Bach. His biography appeared in 1802, and we have to be very skeptical about this story, because first of all, on the title page of the composition there is no dedication to Graf Kaiserling. Secondly, Goldberg was 14 years old, and it is very, very doubtful that a 14-year-old child can play this composition. Not intellectually, not emotionally, and not even technically. Although today, in the 21st century, we have all kinds of Wunderkinder, child prodigies, who play this composition at the ripe old age of 10 or 11. We hear them all over the place. They come from China and Korea and faraway countries. They play it without a single fault, single mistake, without having the slightest idea about the music. And therefore, one should be warned against this, because this is a late masterpiece by Bach. He wrote it in 1740, when he was already 55 years old. 55, I am already older than 55, but 55 in Bach's time was a very old age. People died much younger. And Bach was a great pedagogue. He had many children who were all musical, and he always cared about the musical education of children. Therefore he wrote little preludes, and then he wrote the two-part inventions, later the three-part inventions, and so progressively thinking about the development and the evolution of keyboard music, teaching them not just the technique of keyboard playing, but a good taste in composition. And so when you go through all these, and then the French suites and the English suites, and das wohltemperierte Klavier, the Weltklemper Klavier, then gradually you arrive to the top of the mountain, which is the Goldberg Variations. And it is really not right for a child to start at the top of the mountain. He has to learn mountain climbing. So let's try to go through the variations now. There are 30 of them. 30 variations plus the aria at the beginning of the work and the aria for a second time, which returns at the end. So we have 32 pieces, and the number 32 corresponds to the number of notes which you heard before. 32 notes, 32 pieces. However, there are only 30 variations, and they come in 10 groups of 3. So the number 3 is crucial. 3 is a magical number in all cultures. In German, we say, alle guten Dinge sind drei. So all good things come in threes. And we can think of the Holy Trinity, or we can think of 3 aspects of music: intellectual, emotional, and physical. And there are many other examples of the 3. Now, each group of 3 contain 3 different types of variations. One is a virtuoso piece, a toccata-like, very brilliant, very extroverted piece. Then a very tender and lyrical character piece. And finally, each third variation is a canon. You all know what a canon is. It's not a weapon of mass destruction, but it's like if we play it in G major. So that's probably the best known canon in Western music. Now, Bach is an astonishing intellect, and he builds on the bass canons which are in increasing intervals. He starts with a canon in unison, and then a canon in seconds, in thirds, in fourths, and that this describes the interval. So, for example, you start the canon in unison, so the theme started on this note, and one bar later the second voice imitates this theme on the very same notes. So just try to follow this, it's very difficult for me. Yeah. Then, for example, the canon in seconds is based on this interval. Yeah. So etc. And then we have one on the third, and then one on the fourth, and then on the fifth, etc. Until the canon in ninths. This is very far indeed. So it's good. Now let's go through the variations very briefly. After the aria, now comes the first variation, which is a very brilliant piece. Voices, but you can follow the bass, I hope. And so it's based on dactyls and anapaests, so tam ta ta tam or ta ta tam pam. Yeah? The second variation is a very gentle piece. It's also important to observe that in all the variations, Bach stays in the tonality of G. Mostly G major. In 3 cases, G minor. But never goes anywhere else. Just follows the rules of G major and G minor. But he varies the meter. The meter is the time signature of a piece. So the aria was in 3/4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. First variation was in 3/4. Now the second variation is in double time, in 2/4 time. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Now comes number 3. All multiples of 3 will be canons. So this is our first canon that I already showed you before. This is in 12/8 time. And then after this, the fourth variation is a dance, and it's called a passe-pied. So the passe-pied is like a quick minuet. So you are counting one in a bar, one, two, one, two, one, two, one, two. It's not called a passe-pied by Bach, but I call it a passe-pied because in the fifth partita we have a piece like this. So one has to associate one piece with other pieces. Then comes a very virtuosic toccata-like piece with a new device crossing the hands, like this or like that. Now Bach wrote this composition for clavicembalo, so a harpsichord with two manuals. So I am playing it on the wrong instrument, I do apologize. And many people will not forgive me for that. Hopefully they are not here. However, this is like a religious war, but is it right to play Bach on the piano? For heaven's sake, this is the greatest composer of all times, and this music is way beyond instruments. So, of course, this is one of the very few pieces of Bach where he specifically asked for a harpsichord with two manuals. There are only three pieces. This, then the Italian concerto, and the overture in French style, and our variations. And yet, it really can be played beautifully well on a modern piano if the spirit and the style is properly observed. What is much more problematic in our times are all these transcriptions of the Goldberg variation. It is like an epidemic. People play this on the string trio, they play it for string orchestra, they play it on brass quintet, they play it for saxophones, on balalaika orchestra. I'm not even joking. And it's understandable because this is one of the miracles of culture and music, so everybody would love to play it. But what is important is not just the question of harpsichord versus piano, but this is a solo piece. This is meant to be for one player and not for a group of people. I'm all for groups and for society, and of course what we are experiencing here is also a communal experience, and that's why we are playing concerts and not just listening to music in our living room. So I'm trying to share this music with you, trying to interpret Bach's innermost thoughts. But this should not be played by an ensemble. However, going back to the harpsichord, which has two manuals, and this variation I can play one hand on the upper manual and one hand on the lower manual, and so I never get into a traffic jam. But on one manual there are plenty of traffic jams and plenty of accidents. So to try to avoid those accidents, you have to work out a method how to put one hand over the other one or under the other one, and work out fingerings that the two hands don't get into each other's way. So after this variation, which is an homage a Domenico Scarlatti. Domenico Scarlatti was born in the same year as Bach and Handel, 1685. It was a very good vintage. And he was born in Naples, but didn't write any interesting music until the age of 50. But at the age of 50 he moved to Portugal and subsequently to Spain. And there he blossomed into a wonderfully original composer who wrote basically nothing but harpsichord sonatas. And he's using this device of crossing the hands all the time until the very last years of his life, when they disappear from his music. And the reason is that Spanish food is delicious. And Scarlatti got so fat that he could not cross his arms anymore. So now, back to something more serious. The sixth variation is the canon in seconds. Again in 3/8 time, and it has this flowing semi-quaver bass. But out of 6 notes, only 1 represents our bass line. So we are getting further and further away from our theme. The canon in seconds is a beautiful device that Mozart uses in Ricordare of his Requiem, but that's in F major. So we come back to G major now. The 7th variation is another dance, it's a jig. And this time the description jig is really by Bach. He says, al tempo di giga. And a jig is, as we know, a Scottish or Irish sailor's dance, very lively. So this is a jig, but in Bach's time this way. When we play this, or for example, when you play or conduct Beethoven's 7th Symphony, you try to say Amsterdam, 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 and then the rhythm is right. Now comes another virtuoso variation. Yeah. Then number 9, 3 times 3, our third canon in thirds. This is again in double time, in 4/4. And I would like to mention here the fact that the piano and the keyboard instrument is not a percussive instrument. It's only treated like that very often, unfortunately. If you hit the piano will hit you back. And Johann Sebastian Bach, in the preface to his Inventions, he writes that he wants his students to learn the cantabile art of piano playing, so the singing way. All instruments try to imitate the human voice. And this is a very good example that it's a singing piece. Then immediately we go into the 10th variation, which is called fughetta. So a little fugue in 4 voices in double time. Entries, bass, tenor, soprano, and the last is the alto. And with the 10th variation we come to the end of the first group. After 10 variations, it's obvious that Bach wants to take a rest here. And I will also hold a short rest here, during which we should enjoy our silence. We live in such a noisy world, and we should treasure all opportunities to get away from it. So after the first group, we gently go into the second, and with the 11th variation we have another gently virtuosic variation. Is greeting us. Over the years that I have had the privilege and pleasure to play this composition, I had to learn never to wear cufflinks, because cufflinks get in the way when you play this. Now, number 12, 4 times 3, canon in fourths. Which each note is repeated 3 times. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah? So we have, and the second voice comes in a 4th lower, so, but it's playing the theme in contrary motion, like a mirror. So tour de force from Bach, which he will repeat in the next canon. Now, number 13 is the most beautiful of the whole set. So another cantabile bel canto piece. And we will come later to the brother of this variation, the great 25th variation in minor, that Wanda Landowska, the great cembalo player, called the Black Pearl. And I would like to call number 13 the White Pearl, but it's a real one, not an artificial pearl. Now, number 14 is Scarlatti again. And 15, yeah, 5 times 3 is extraordinary, because listen to this. first time we have a minor variation. This is the canon in fifth, so the bass from the aria is now chromatically colored. And the chromaticism depicts man's suffering. This is music from the St. John and St. Matthew Passion, with all these Seufzer, these sighing, sospiri motives. So, and this is another canon in mirror shape. So one voice is descending and the other one ascending. It's also interesting to know that Bach gives us very few instructions, for example, tempo indications, almost never. And here he writes andante. Now, andante means at a walking pace. Andante is not, as many of you would think, a slow tempo. But andare in Italian means to go, to walk. So, in gehender Bewegung in German. And with number 15 we come to the half of the work, and it is appropriate to take another short break here to contemplate. And Bach meant it like that because the next variation is called an ouverture, a French ouverture, and an ouverture means a grand opening. Beautifully festive music. You have to think here of the French royal court of Louis XIV and composers such as Lully, Rameau, Couperin. So the French ouverture is in two parts, with a very festive, slower part with dotted rhythm, so pam, pa-pam, pa-pam, pa-pam. And a second, faster part, which is fugato-like, which is like this in Bach. In 3/8 time he changes the meter. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, against the dotting of the first part. The two tempi have to have a relationship. Yam, pa-pam, pa-pam. Then comes another virtuoso piece, but not overly extroverted. This is important in the Goldberg variations, that there are some slighter pieces where he relaxes the tension, the emotional and the intellectual tension, and he must have these alternations of playfulness. Let's not forget that in most European languages, certainly in German or English or French, we play an instrument. Man spielt ein Instrument. So some people think great art only comes